who were enjoying an early round, were horrified to find the body of a man lying face downwards on the 7th tee. Even before they turned him over, they had guessed him to be Captain Cecily, a well-known figure on the links, and who always wore a golf coat of a peculiarly bright blue color. Captain Cecily was often seen out on the links early in the morning, practicing, and it was thought at first that he had been suddenly overcome by some form of heart disease. Gut examination by a doctor revealed the sinister fact that he had been murdered, stabbed to the heart with a significant object, a woman's hat pin. He was also found to have been dead at least 12 hours. That put an entirely different complexion on the matter, and very soon some interesting facts came to light. Practically the last person to see Captain Cecily alive was his friend and partner Mr. Hollaby of the Porcupine Assurance Co., and he told his story as follows. Cecily and he played around earlier in the day. After tea the other suggested that they should play a few more holes before it got too dark to see. Hollaby assented. Cecily seemed in good spirits, and was in excellent form. There is a public footpath that crosses the links, and just as they were playing up to the 6th green, Hollaby noticed a woman coming along it. She was very tall and dressed in brown, but he did not observe her particularly, and Cecily, he thought, did not notice her at all. The footpath in question crosses in front of the 7th tee, continued Tommy. The woman had passed along this, and was standing at the farther side, as though waiting. Captain Cecily was the first to reach the tee, as Mr. Hollaby was replacing the pin in the hole. As the latter came towards the tee, he was astonished to see Cecily and the woman talking together. As he came nearer, they both turned abruptly, Cecily calling over his shoulder, "Shan't he be a minute?" The two of them walked off side by side, still deep in earnest conversation. The footpath there leaves the course, and passing between two narrow hedges of neighboring gardens comes out on the road to Windlesham. Captain Cecily was as good as his word. He reappeared within a minute or two, much to Hollaby's satisfaction, as two other players were coming up behind them, and the light was failing rapidly. They drove off, and at once Hollaby noticed that something had occurred to upset his companion. Not only did he fuzzle his drive badly, but his face was worried, and his forehead creased in a big frown. He hardly answered his companion's remarks, and his golf was atrocious. Evidently something had occurred to put him completely off his game. They played that hole and the 8th, and then Captain Cecily declared abruptly that the light was too bad and that he was off home. Just at that point there is another of those narrow slips leading to the Windlesham Road, and Captain Cecily departed that way, which was a short cut to his home, a small bungalow on the road in question. The other two players came up, a Major Barnard and Mr. Lecky, and to them Hollaby mentioned Captain Cecily's sudden change of manner. They also had seen him speaking to the woman in brown, but had not been near enough to see her face. All three men wondered what she could have said to upset their friend to that extent. They returned to the clubhouse together, and as far as was known at the time, were the last people to see Captain Cecily alive. The day was a Wednesday, and on Wednesdays cheap tickets to London are issued. The man and wife who ran Captain Cecily's small bungalow were up in town according to custom, and did not return until the late train. They entered the bungalow as usual, and supposed their master to be in his room asleep. Mrs. Cecily, his wife, was away on a visit. The murder of the captain was a 9 days' wonder. Nobody could suggest a motive for it. The identity of the tall woman in brown was eagerly discussed, but without result. The police were, as usual, blamed for their supineness most unjustly, as time was to show. For a week later, a girl called Doris Evans was arrested and charged with the murder of Captain Anthony Cecily. The police had had little to work upon. A strand of fair hair caught in the dead man's fingers, and a few threads of flame-colored wool caught in one of the buttons of his blue coat. Diligent inquiries at the railway station and elsewhere had elicited the following facts. A young girl dressed in a flame-colored coat and skirt had arrived by Maine that evening about 7 o'clock, and had asked the way to Captain Cecily's house. The same girl had reappeared again at the station, 2 hours later. Her hat was awry and her hair tousled, and she seemed in a state of great agitation. She inquired about the trains back to town, and was continually looking over her shoulder as though afraid of something. Our police force is in many ways very wonderful. With this slender evidence to go upon, they managed to track down the girl, and identify her as one Doris Evans. She was charged with murder, and cautioned that anything she might say would be used against her, but she nevertheless persisted in making a statement, and this statement she repeated again in detail, without any substantial variation, at the subsequent proceedings. Her story was this. She was a typist by profession, and had made friends one evening, in a cinema, with a well-dressed man who declared he had taken a fancy to her. His name, he told her, was Anthony, and he suggested that she should come down to his bungalow at Sunningdale. She had no idea then, or at any other time, that he had a wife. It was arranged between them that she should come down on the following Wednesday, the day, you will remember, when the servants would be absent and his wife away from home. In the end he told her his full name was Anthony Cecily, and gave her the name of his house. She duly arrived at the bungalow on the evening in question, and was greeted by Cecily, who had just come in from Links. Though he professed himself delighted to see her, the girl declared that from the first his manner was strange and different. A half-acknowledged fear sprang up in her, and she wished fervently that she had not come. After a simple meal which was already prepared, Cecily suggested going out for a stroll. The girl consenting, he took her out of the house, down the road, and along the islip onto the golf course. And then suddenly, just as they were crossing the 7th tee, he seemed to go completely mad. Drawing a revolver from his pocket, he brandished it in the air, declaring that he had come to the end of his tether. Everything must go. I'm ruined, done for. And you shall go with me. I shall shoot you first, then myself. They will find our bodies here in the morning side by side together in death. And so on, a lot more. He had hold of Doris Evans by the arm, and she, realizing she had to do with a madman, made frantic efforts to free herself, or failing that to get the revolver away from him. They struggled together, and in that struggle he must have torn out a piece of her hair and got the wool of her coat entangled on a button. Finally, with a desperate effort, she freed herself, and ran for her life across the golf links, expecting every minute to be shot down with a revolver bullet. She fell twice, tripping over the heather, but eventually regained the road to the station and realized that she was not being pursued. That is the story that Doris Evans tells, and from which she has never varied. She strenuously denies that she ever struck at him with a hatpin in self-defense, a natural enough thing to do under the circumstances, though and one which may well be the truth. In support of her story, a revolver has been found in the furze bushes near where the body is lying. It had not been fired. Doris Evans has been sent for trial, but the mystery still remains a mystery. If her story is to be believed, who was it who stabbed Captain Cecily? The other woman, the tall woman in brown whose appearance so upset him? So far no one has explained her connection with the case. She appears out of space suddenly on the footpath across the links, she disappears along the slip, and no one ever hears of her again. Who was she? A local resident? A visitor from London? If so, did she come by car or train? There is nothing remarkable about her except her height. No one seems to be able to describe her appearance. She could not have been Doris Evans, for Doris Evans is small and fair, and moreover was only just then arriving at the station. The wife, suggested Tuppence. What about the wife? A very natural suggestion. But Mrs. Cecily is also a small woman, and besides Mr. Hollaby knows her well by sight, and there seems no doubt that she was really away from home. One further development has come to light. The Porcupine Assurance Co. is in liquidation. The accounts reveal the most daring misappropriation of funds. The reasons for Captain Cecily's wild words to Doris Evans are now quite apparent. For some years past, he must have been systematically embezzling money. Neither Mr. Hollaby, nor his son, had any idea of what was going on. They are practically ruined. The case stands like this. Captain Cecily was on the verge of discovery and ruin. Suicide would be a natural solution, but the nature of the wound rules that theory out. Who killed him? Was it Doris Evans? Was it the mysterious woman in brown? Tommy paused, took a sip of milk, made a wry face, and bit cautiously at the cheesecake. 16 The Sunningdale mystery, continued, of course, murmured Tommy. I saw at once where the hitch in this particular case lay, and just where the police were going astray. Yes, said Tuppence eagerly. Tommy shook his head sadly. I wish I did. Tuppence, it's dead easy being the old man in the corner up to a certain point. Gut the solution beats me. Who did murder the beggar? I don't know. He took some more newspaper cuttings out of his pocket. Further exhibits. Mr. Hollaby. His son. Mrs. Cecily. Doris Evans. Tuppence pounced on the last, and looked at it for some time. She didn't murder him anyway, she remarked at last. Not with a hat pin. Why this certainty? A Lady Molly touch. She's got bobbed hair. Only one woman in 20 uses hat pins nowadays, anyway, long hair or short. Hats fit tight and pull on, there's no need for such a thing. Still, she might have had one by her. My dear boy, we don't keep them as heirlooms. What on earth should she have brought a hat pin down to Sunningdale for? Then it must have been the other woman, the woman in brown. I wished she hadn't been tall. Then she could have been the wife. I always suspect wives who are away at the time and so couldn't have had anything to do with it. If she found her husband carrying on with that girl, it would be quite natural for her to go for him with a hat pin. I shall have to be careful, I see, remarked Tommy. But Tuppence was deep in thought and refused to be drawn. What were the Cecilys like? She asked suddenly. What sort of thing did people say about them? As far as I can make out, they were very popular. He and his wife were supposed to be devoted to one another. That's what makes the business of the girl so odd. It's the last thing you'd have expected of a man like Cecily. He was an ex-soldier, you know. Came into a good bit of money, retired and went into this insurance business. The last man in the world, apparently, whom you would have suspected of being a crook. Is it absolutely certain that he was the crook? Couldn't it have been the other two who took the money? The Hollabys? They say they're ruined. Oh, they say. Perhaps they've got it all in a bank under another name. I put it foolishly, I dare say, but you know what I mean. Suppose they'd been speculating with the money for some time, unbeknownst to Cecily, and lost it all. It might be jolly convenient for them that Cecily died just when he did. Tommy tapped the photograph of Mr. Hollaby Sr. with his fingernail. So you're accusing this respectable gentleman of murdering his friend and partner? You forget that he parted from Cecily on the links in full view of Barnard and Lecky, and spent the evening in the Dormy house. Besides, there's the hat pin. Bother the hat pin, said Tuppence impatiently. That hat pin, you think, points to the crime having been committed by a woman. Naturally. Don't you agree? No. Men are notoriously old-fashioned. It takes them ages to rid themselves of preconceived ideas. They associate hatpins and hairpins with the female sex, and call them women's weapons. They may have been in the past, but they're both rather out of date now. Why, I haven't had a hatpin or hairpin for the last 4 years. Then you think that it was a man killed Cecily. The hatpin was used to make it seem a woman's crime. There's something in what you say, Tuppence, said Tommy slowly. It's extraordinary how things seem to straighten themselves out when you talk a thing over. Tuppence nodded. Everything must be logical if you look at it the right way. And remember what Marriott once said about the amateur point of view, that it had the intimacy. We know something about people like Captain Cecily and his wife. We know what they're likely to do and what they're not likely to do. And we've each got our special knowledge. Tommy smiled. You mean, he said, that you are an authority on what people with bobbed and shingled heads are likely to have in their possession, and that you have an intimate acquaintance with what wives are likely to feel and do. Something of the sort. And what about me? What is my special knowledge? Do husbands pick up girls, etc.? No, said Tuppence gravely. You know the course you've been on, it not as a detective, searching for clues, but as a golfer. You know about golf, and what's likely to put a man off his game. It must have been something pretty serious to put Cecily off his game. His handicaps too, and from the 7th tee on he played like a child, so they say. Who say? Barnard and Lecky. They were playing just behind him, you remember. That was after he met the woman, the tall woman in brown. They saw him speaking to her, didn't they? Yes, at least. Tommy broke off. Tuppence looked up at him, and was puzzled. He was staring at the piece of string in his fingers, but staring with the eyes of one who sees something very different. Tommy, what is it? Be quiet, Tuppence. I'm playing the 6th hole at Sunningdale. Cecily and old Hollaby are holding out on the 6th green ahead of me. It's getting dusk, but I can see that bright blue coat of Cecily's clearly enough. And on the footpath to the left of me there's a woman coming along. She hasn't crossed from the ladies' course that's on the right. I should have seen her if she had done so. And it's odd I didn't see her on the footpath before, from the 5th tee, for instance. He paused. You said just now I knew the course, Tuppence. Just behind the 6th tee, there's a little hut or shelter made of turf. Anyone could wait in there until the right moment came. They could change their appearance there. I mean, tell me, Tuppence, this is where your special knowledge comes in again. Would it be very difficult for a man to look like a woman, and then change back to being a man again? Could he wear a skirt over +4s, for instance? Certainly he could. The woman would look a bit bulky, that would be all. A longish brown skirt, say, a brown sweater of the kind both men and women wear, and a woman's felt hat with a bunch of side curls attached each side. That would be all that was needed. I am speaking, of course, of what would pass at a distance, which I take to be what you are driving at. Switch off the skirt, take off the hat and curls, and put on a man's cap which you can carry rolled up in your hand, and there you'd be back as a man again. And the time required for the transformation from woman to man, 1.5 minutes at the outside, probably a good deal less. The other way about would take longer. You'd have to arrange the hat and curls a bit, and the skirt would stick getting it on over the +4s. That doesn't worry me. It's the time for the first that matters. As I tell you, I'm playing the 6th hole. The woman in brown has reached the 7th tee now. She crosses it and waits. Cecily in his blue coat goes towards her. They stand together a minute, and then they follow the path round the trees out of sight. Hollaby is on the tee alone. 2 or 3 minutes pass. I'm on the green now. The man in the blue coat comes back and drives off, fushling badly. The light's getting worse. I and my partner go on. Ahead of us are those two, Cecily slicing and topping and doing everything he shouldn't do. At the 8th green, I see him stride off and vanish down the slip. What happened to him to make him play like a different man? The woman in brown or the man, if you think it was a man? Exactly, and where they were standing out of sight, remember, of those coming after them there's a deep tangle of furze bushes. You could thrust a body in there, and it would be pretty certain to lie hidden until the morning. Tommy. You think it was then, but someone would have heard. Heard what? The doctors agreed death must have been instantaneous. I've seen men killed instantaneously in the war. They don't cry out as a rule, just a gurgle, or a moan, perhaps just a sigh, or a funny little cough. Cecily comes towards the 7th tee, and the woman comes forward and speaks to him. He recognizes her perhaps, as a man he knows masquerading. Curious to learn the why and wherefore, he allows himself to be drawn along the footpath out of sight. One stab with the deadly hatpin as they walk along. Cecily falls dead. The other man drags his body into the furze bushes, strips off the blue coat, then sheds his own skirt and the hat and curls. He puts on Cecily's well-known blue coat and cap, and strides back to the tee. 3 minutes would do it. The others behind can't see his face, only the peculiar blue coat they know so well. They never doubt that it's Cecily, but he doesn't play Cecily's brand of golf. They all say he played like a different man. Of course he did. He was a different man. But point number 2. His action in bringing the girl down there was the action of a different man. It wasn't Cecily who met Doris Evans at a cinema, and induced her to come down to Sunningdale. It was a man calling himself Cecily. Remember, Doris Evans wasn't arrested until a fortnight after the crime. She never saw the body. If she had, she might have bewildered everyone by declaring that that wasn't the man who took her out on the golf links that night, and spoke so wildly of suicide. It was a carefully laid plot. The girl invited down for Wednesday when Cecily's house would be empty, then the hat pin which pointed to its being a woman's doing. The murderer meets the girl, takes her into the bungalow and gives her supper, then takes her out on the links, and when he gets to the scene of the crime, brandishes his revolver and scares the life out of her. Once she has taken to her heels, all he has to do is to pull out the body and leave it lying on the tee. The revolver he chucks into the bushes. Then he makes a neat parcel of the skirt and hat, and now I admit I'm guessing in all probability walks to Woking, which is only about 6 or 7 miles away, and goes back to town from there. Wait a minute, said Tuppence. There's one thing you haven't explained. What about Hollaby? Hollaby, yes. I admit that the people behind couldn't have seen whether it was really Cecily or not. But you can't tell me that the man who was playing with him was so hypnotized by the blue coat that he never looked at his face. My dear old thing, said Tommy. That's just the point. Hollaby knew all right. You see, I'm adopting your theory that Hollaby and his son were the real embezzlers. The murderer's got to be a man who knew Cecily pretty well, knew, for instance, about the servants being always out on a Wednesday, and that his wife was away. And also someone who was able to get an impression of Cecily's latchkey. I think Hollaby Jr. would fulfill all these requirements. He's about the same age and height as Cecily, and they were both clean-shaven men. Doris Evans probably saw several photographs of the murdered man reproduced in the papers, but as you yourself observed, one can just see that it's a man, and that's about all. Didn't she ever see Hollaby in court? The son never appeared in the case at all. Why should he? He had no evidence to give. It was old Hollaby, with his irreproachable alibi, who stood in the limelight throughout. Nobody has even bothered to inquire what son was doing that particular evening. It all fits in, admitted Tuppence. She paused a minute, and then asked, "Are you going to tell all this to the police?" "I don't know if they'd listen." "They'll listen all right," said an unexpected voice behind him. Tommy swung round to confront Inspector Marriott. The inspector was sitting at the next table. In front of him was a poached egg. "Often drop in here to lunch," said Inspector Marriott. "As I was saying, we'll listen all right. In fact, I've been listening. I don't mind telling you that we've not been quite satisfied all along over those porcupine figures. You see, we've had our suspicions of those Hollabys. But nothing to go upon. Too sharp for us. Then this murder came, and that seemed to upset all our ideas. God thanks to you and the lady, sir, we'll confront young Hollaby and Doris Evans and see if she recognizes him. I rather fancy she will. That's a very ingenious idea of yours about the blue coat. I'll see that Blunt's brilliant detectives get the credit for it." "You are a nice man, Inspector Marriott," said Tuppence gratefully. "We think a lot of you too at the Yard," replied that stolid gentleman. "You'd be surprised. If I may ask you, sir, what's the meaning of that piece of string?" "Nothing," said Tommy, stuffing it into his pocket. "A bad habit of mine. As to the cheesecake and the milk, I am on a diet. Nervous dyspepsia. Busy men are always martyrs to it." "Al," said the detective. "I thought perhaps you'd been reading. Well, it's of no consequence." But the inspector's eyes twinkled. 17 The House of Lurking Death. What dash began Tuppence, and then stopped. She had just entered the private office of Mr. Blunt from the adjoining one marked Clerks, and was surprised to behold her lord and master with his eye riveted to the private peephole into the outer office. "SSH, said Tommy, warningly. "Didn't you hear the buzzer? It's a girl, rather a nice girl. In fact, she looks to me a frightfully nice girl. Albert is telling her all that tosh about my being engaged with Scotland Yard." "Let me see," demanded Tuppence. Somewhat unwillingly, Tommy moved aside. Tuppence in her turn glued her eye to the peephole. "She's not bad," admitted Tuppence. "And her clothes are simply the latest shout." "She's perfectly lovely," said Tommy. "She's like those girls Mason writes about, you know, frightfully sympathetic, and beautiful, and distinctly intelligent without being too saucy. I think, yes, I certainly think I shall be the great Hanaud this morning. HRN, said Tuppence. If there is one detective out of all the others whom you are most unlike, I should say it was Hanaud. Can you do the lightning changes of personality? Can you be the great comedian, the little gutter boy, the serious and sympathetic friend all in 5 minutes? I know this, said Tommy, rapping sharply on the desk. I am the captain of the ship, and don't you forget it, Tuppence. I'm going to have her in. He pressed the buzzer on his desk. Albert appeared ushering in the client. The girl stopped in the doorway as though undecided. Tommy came forward. Come in, mademoiselle, he said kindly, and seat yourself here. Tuppence choked audibly, and Tommy turned upon her with a swift change of manner. His tone was menacing. You spoke, Miss Robinson? No, I thought not. He turned back to the girl. We will not be serious or formal, he said. You will just tell me all about it, and then we will discuss the best way to help you. You are very kind, said the girl. Excuse me, but are you a foreigner? A fresh choke from Tuppence. Tommy glared in her direction out of the corner of his eye. Not exactly, he said with difficulty. But of late years I have worked a good deal abroad. My methods are the methods of the sword. Oh. The girl seemed impressed. She was, as Tommy had indicated, a very charming girl. Young and slim, with a trace of golden hair peeping out from under her little brown felt hat, and big serious eyes. That she was nervous could be plainly seen. Her little hands were twisting themselves together, and she kept clasping and unclasping the catch of her lacquer red handbag. First of all, Mr. Blunt, I must tell you that my name is Lois Hargreaves. I live in a great rambling old-fashioned house called Thornley Grange. It is in the heart of the country. There is the village of Thornley nearby, but it is very small and insignificant. There is plenty of hunting in winter, and we get tennis in summer, and I have never felt lonely there. Indeed, I much prefer country to town life. I tell you this so that you may realize that in a country village like ours, everything that happens is of supreme importance. About a week ago, I got a box of chocolates sent through the post. There was nothing inside to indicate who they came from. Now I myself am not particularly fond of chocolates, but the others in the house are, and the box was passed around. As a result, everyone who had eaten any chocolates was taken ill. We sent for the doctor, and after various inquiries as to what other things had been eaten, he took the remains of the chocolates away with him, and had them analyzed. Mr. Blunt, those chocolates contained arsenic. Not enough to kill anyone, but enough to make anyone quite ill. Extraordinary, commented Tommy. Dr. Burton was very excited over the matter. It seems that this was the third occurrence of the kind in the neighborhood. In each case a big house was selected, and the inmates were taken ill after eating the mysterious chocolates. It looked as though some local person of weak intellect was playing a particularly fiendish practical joke. Quite so, Miss Hargreaves. Dr. Burton put it down to socialist agitation rather absurdly, I thought. But there are one or two malcontents in Thornley village, and it seemed possible that they might have had something to do with it. Dr. Burton was very keen that I should put the whole thing in the hands of the police. A very natural suggestion, said Tommy. But you have not done so, I gather, Miss Hargreaves. No, admitted the girl. I hate the fuss and the publicity that would ensue, and you see, I know our local inspector. I can never imagine him finding out anything. I have often seen your advertisements, and I told Dr. Burton that it would be much better to call in a private detective. I see. You say a great deal about discretion in your advertisement. I take that to mean that you would not make anything public without my consent. Tommy looked at her curiously, but it was Tuppence who spoke. I think, she said quietly, that it would be as well if Miss Hargreaves told us everything. She laid a special stress upon the last word, and Lois Hargreaves flushed nervously. Yes, said Tommy quickly. Miss Robinson is right. You must tell us everything. You will not. She hesitated. Everything you say is understood to be strictly in confidence. Thank you. I know that I ought to have been quite frank with you. I have a reason for not going to the police. Mr. Blunt, that box of chocolates was sent by someone in our house. How do you know that, mademoiselle? It's very simple. I've got a habit of drawing a little silly thing, 3 fish intertwined, whenever I have a pencil in my hand. A parcel of silk stockings arrived from a certain shop in London not long ago. We were at the breakfast table. I'd just been marking something in the newspaper, and without thinking, I began to draw my silly little fish on the label of the parcel before cutting the string and opening it. I thought no more about the matter, but when I was examining the piece of brown paper in which the chocolates had been sent, I caught sight of the corner of the original label, most of which had been torn off. My silly little drawing was on it. Tommy drew his chair forward. That is very serious. It creates, as you say, a very strong presumption that the sender of the chocolates is a member of your household. Gut, you will forgive me if I say that I still do not see why that fact should render you indisposed to call in the police. Lois Hargreaves looked him squarely in the face. I will tell you, Mr. Blunt. I may want the whole thing hushed up. Tommy retired gracefully from the position. In that case, he murmured, we know where we are. I see, Miss Hargreaves, that you are not disposed to tell me who it is you suspect. I suspect no one, but there are possibilities. Quite so. Now will you describe the household to me in detail? The servants, with the exception of the parlor maid, are all old ones who have been with us many years. I must explain to you, Mr. Blunt, that I was brought up by my aunt, Lady Radcliffe, who was extremely wealthy. Her husband made a big fortune, and was knighted. It was he who bought Thornley Grange, but he died 2 years after going there, and it was then that Lady Radcliffe sent for me to come and make my home with her. I was her only living relation. The other inmate of the house was Dennis Radcliffe, her husband's nephew. I have always called him cousin, but of course he is really nothing of the kind. Aunt Lucy always said openly that she intended to leave her money, with the exception of a small provision for me, to Dennis. It was Radcliffe money, she said, and ought to go to a Radcliffe. However, when Dennis was 22, she quarreled violently with him over some debts that he had run up, I think. When she died, a year later, I was astonished to find that she had made a will leaving all her money to me. It was, I know, a great blow to Dennis, and I felt very badly about it. I would have given him the money if he would have taken it, but it seems that that kind of thing can't be done. However, as soon as I was 21, I made a will leaving it all to him. That's the least I can do. So if I'm run over by a motor, Dennis will come into his own. Exactly, said Tommy. And when were you 21, if I may ask the question? Just 3 weeks ago. Al, said Tommy. Now will you give me fuller particulars of the members of your household at this minute? Servants or others? Both. The servants, as I say, have been with us some time. There is old Mrs. Holloway, the cook, and her niece Rose, the kitchen maid. Then there are 2 elderly housemaids, and Hannah, who was my aunt's maid and who has always been devoted to me. The parlor maid is called Esther Quant, and seems a very nice quiet girl. As for ourselves, there is Miss Logan, who was Aunt Lucy's companion and who runs the house for me, and Captain Radcliffe Dennis, you know, whom I told you about, and there is a girl called Mary Chilcott, an old school friend of mine who is staying with us. Tommy thought for a moment. That all seems fairly clear and straightforward, Miss Hargreaves, he said after a minute or two. I take it that you have no special reason for attaching suspicion more to one person than another? You are only afraid it might prove to be, well, not a servant, shall we say? That's it exactly, Mr. Blunt. I have honestly no idea who used that piece of brown paper. The handwriting was printed. There seems only one thing to be done, said Tommy. I must be on the spot. The girl looked at him inquiringly. Tommy went on after a moment's thought. I suggest that you prepare the way for the arrival of, say, Mr. and Miss Van Dusen, American friends of yours. Will you be able to do that quite naturally? Oh, Yes. There will be no difficulty at all. When will you come down, tomorrow or the day after? Tomorrow, if you please. There is no time to waste. That is settled, then. The girl rose, and held out her hand. One thing, Miss Hargreaves, not a word, mind, to anyone at all, that we are not what we seem. What do you think of it, Tuppence? He asked, when he returned from showing the visitor out. I don't like it, said Tuppence decidedly. Especially I don't like the chocolates having so little arsenic in them. What do you mean? Don't you see? All those chocolates being sent round the neighborhood were a blind to establish the idea of a local maniac. Then, when the girl was really poisoned, it would be thought to be the same thing. You see, but for a stroke of luck, no one would ever have guessed that the chocolates were actually sent by someone in the house itself. That was a stroke of luck. You're right. You think it's a deliberate plot against the girl herself? I'm afraid so. I remember reading about old Lady Radcliffe's will. That girl has come into a terrific lot of money. Yes, and she came of age and made a will 3 weeks ago. It looks bad for Dennis Radcliffe. He gains by her death. Tuppence nodded. The worst of it is that she thinks so too, that's why she won't have the police called in. Already she suspects him. And she must be more than half in love with him to act as she has done. In that case, said Tommy thoughtfully, why the devil doesn't he marry her? Much simpler and safer. Tuppence stared at him. You've said a mouthful, she observed. Oh, boy. I'm getting ready to be Miss Van Dusen, you observe. Why rush to crime, where there is a lawful means near at hand? Tuppence reflected for a minute or two. I've got it, she announced. Clearly he must have married a barmaid whilst at Oxford. Origin of the quarrel with his aunt. That explains everything. Then why not send poisoned sweets to the barmaid, suggested Tommy. Much more practical. I wish you wouldn't jump to these wild conclusions, Tuppence. They're deductions, said Tuppence, with a good deal of dignity. This is your first corrida, my friend, but when you have been 20 minutes in the arena Tommy flung the office cushion at her. 18 The House of Lurking Death, continued, Tuppence, I say, Tuppence, come here. It was breakfast time the next morning. Tuppence hurried out of her bedroom and into the dining room. Tommy was striding up and down, the open newspaper in his hand. What's the matter? Tommy wheeled round, and shoved the paper into her hand, pointing to the headlines. Mysterious poisoning case, deaths from fig sandwiches. Tuppence read on. This mysterious outbreak of ptomaine poisoning had occurred at Thornley Grange. The deaths so far reported were those of Miss Lois Hargreaves, the owner of the house, and the parlour maid, Esther Quant. A Captain Radcliffe and a Miss Logan were reported to be still seriously ill. The cause of the outbreak was supposed to be some fig paste used in sandwiches, since another lady, a Miss Chilcot, who had not partaken of these, was reported to be quite well. We must get down there at once, said Tommy. That girl. That perfectly ripping girl. Why the devil didn't I go straight down there with her yesterday? If you had, said Tuppence, you'd probably have eaten fig sandwiches too for tea, and then you'd have been dead. Come on, let's start at once. I see it says that Dennis Radcliffe is seriously ill also. Probably shamming, the dirty blackguard. They arrived at the small village of Thornley about midday. An elderly woman with red eyes opened the door to them when they arrived at Thornley Grange. Look here, said Tommy quickly before she could speak. I'm not a reporter or anything like that. Miss Hargreaves came to see me yesterday, and asked me to come down here. Is there anyone I can see? Dr. Burton is here now if you'd like to speak to him, said the woman doubtfully. Or Miss Chilcot. She's making all the arrangements. But Tommy had caught at the first suggestion. Dr. Burton, he said authoritatively. I should like to see him at once if he is here. The woman showed them into a small morning room. 5 minutes later the door opened, and a tall elderly man with bent shoulders and a kind but worried face came in. Dr. Burton, said Tommy. He produced his professional card. Miss Hargreaves called on me yesterday with reference to those poisoned chocolates. I came down to investigate the matter at her request, alas. Too late. The doctor looked at him keenly. You are Mr. Blunt himself? Yes. This is my assistant, Miss Robinson. The doctor bowed to Tuppence. Under the circumstances, there is no need for reticence. But for the episode of the chocolates, I might have believed these deaths to be the result of severe ptomaine poisoning, but ptomaine poisoning of an unusually virulent kind. There is gastrointestinal inflammation and hemorrhage. As it is, I am taking the fig paste to be analyzed. You suspect arsenic poisoning? No. The poison, if a poison has been employed, is something far more potent and swift in its action. It looks more like some powerful vegetable toxin. I see. I should like to ask you, Dr. Burton, whether you are thoroughly convinced that Captain Radcliffe is suffering from the same form of poisoning. The doctor looked at him. Captain Radcliffe is not suffering from any sort of poisoning now. Aha, said Tommy. Captain Radcliffe died at 5 o'clock this morning. Tommy was utterly taken aback. The doctor prepared to depart. And the other victim, Miss Logan? Asked Tuppence. I have every reason to hope that she will recover since she has survived so far. Being an older woman, the poison seems to have had less effect on her. I will let you know the result of the analysis, Mr. Blunt. In the meantime, Miss Chilcot will, I am sure, tell you anything you want to know. As he spoke, the door opened, and a girl appeared. She was tall, with a tanned face, and steady blue eyes. Dr. Burton performed the necessary introductions. I am glad you have come, Mr. Blunt, said Mary Chilcot. This affair seems too terrible. Is there anything you want to know that I can tell you? Where did the fig paste come from? It is a special kind that comes from London. We often have it. No one suspected that this particular pot differed from any of the others. Personally, I dislike the flavor of figs. That explains my immunity. I cannot understand how Dennis was affected, since he was out for tea. He must have picked up a sandwich when he came home, I suppose. Tommy felt Tuppence's hand press his arm ever so slightly. What time did he come in? He asked. I don't really know. I could find out. Thank you, Miss Chilcot. It doesn't matter. You have no objection, I hope, to my questioning the servants. Please do anything you like, Mr. Blunt. I am nearly distraught. Tell me you don't think there has been foul play. Her eyes were very anxious as she put the question. I don't know what to think. We shall soon know. Yes, I suppose Dr. Burton will have the paste analyzed. Quickly excusing herself, she went out by the window to speak to one of the gardeners. You take the housemaids, Tuppence, said Tommy, and I'll find my way to the kitchen. I say, Miss Chilcot may feel very distraught, but she doesn't look it. Tuppence nodded assent without replying. Husband and wife met half an hour later. Now to pool results, said Tommy. The sandwiches came out from tea, and the parlor maid ate one. That's how she got it in the neck. Cook is positive Dennis Radcliffe hadn't returned when tea was cleared away. Query, how did he get poisoned? He came in at 7:15, said Tuppence. Housemaid saw him from one of the windows. He had a cocktail before dinner in the library. She was just clearing away the glass now, and luckily I got it from her before she washed it. It was after that he complained of feeling ill. Good, said Tommy. I'll take that glass along to Burton presently. Anything else? I'd like you to see Hannah, the maid. She's queer. How do you mean queer? She looks to me as though she were going off her head. Let me see her. Tuppence led the way upstairs. Hannah had a small sitting room of her own. The maid sat upright on a high chair. On her knees was an open Bible. She did not look towards the two strangers as they entered. Instead, she continued to read aloud to herself. Let hot burning coals fall upon them, let them be cast into the fire and into the pit, that they never rise up again. May I speak to you a minute? Asked Tommy. Hannah made an impatient gesture with her hand. This is no time. The time is running short, I say. I will follow upon mine enemies and overtake them, neither will I turn again till I have destroyed them. So it is written. The word of the Lord has come to me. I am the scourge of the Lord. Mad as a hatter, murmured Tommy. She's been going on like that all the time, whispered Tuppence. Tommy picked up a book that was lying open, face downwards on the table. He glanced at the title and slipped it into his pocket. Suddenly the old woman rose and turned towards them menacingly. Go out from here. The time is at hand. I am the flail of the Lord. The wind blow it where it listeth, so do I destroy. The ungodly shall perish. This is a house of evil, I tell you. Beware of the wrath of the Lord, whose handmaiden I am. She advanced upon them fiercely. Tommy thought it best to humor her and withdrew. As he closed the door, he saw her pick up the Bible again. I wonder if she's always been like that, he muttered. He drew from his pocket the book he had picked up off the table. Look at that. Funny reading for an ignorant maid. Tuppence took the book. Materia Medica, she murmured. She looked at the fly-leaf. Edward Logan. It's an old book. Tommy, I wonder if we could see Miss Logan? Dr. Burton said she was better. Shall we ask Miss Chilcot? No. Let's get hold of a housemaid, and send her in to ask. After a brief delay, they were informed that Miss Logan would see them. They were taken into a big bedroom facing over the lawn. In the bed was an old lady with white hair, her delicate old face drawn by suffering. I have been very ill, she said faintly. And I can't talk much, but Ellen tells me you are detectives. Lois went to consult you then. She spoke of doing so. Yes, Miss Logan, said Tommy. We don't want to tire you, but perhaps you can answer a few questions. The maid, Hannah, is she quite right in her head? Miss Logan looked at them with obvious surprise. Oh. Yes. She is very religious, but there is nothing wrong with her. Tommy held out the book he had taken from the table. Is this yours, Miss Logan? Yes. It was one of my father's books. He was a great doctor, one of the pioneers of serum therapeutics. The old lady's voice rang with pride. Quite so, said Tommy. I thought I knew his name, he added mendaciously. This book now, did you lend it to Hannah? To Hannah? Miss Logan raised herself in bed with indignation. No, indeed. She wouldn't understand the first word of it. It is a highly technical book. Yes. I see that. Yet I found it in Hannah's room. Disgraceful, said Miss Logan. I will not have the servants touching my things. Where ought it to be? In the bookshelf in my sitting room, or stay, I lent it to Mary. The dear girl is very interested in herbs. She has made 1 or 2 experiments in my little kitchen. I have a little place of my own, you know, where I brew liqueurs and make preserves in the old-fashioned way. Dear Lucy, Lady Radcliffe, you know, used to swear by my tansy tea, a wonderful thing for a cold in the head. Poor Lucy, she was subject to colds. So is Dennis. Dear boy, his father was my first cousin. Tommy interrupted these reminiscences. This kitchen of yours? Does anyone else use it except you and Miss Chilcot? Hannah clears up there. And she boils the kettle there for our early morning tea. Thank you, Miss Logan, said Tommy. There is nothing more I want to ask you at present. I hope we haven't tired you too much. He left the room and went down the stairs, frowning to himself. There is something here, my dear Mr. Ricardo, that I do not understand. I hate this house, said Tuppence with a shiver. Let's go for a good long walk and try to think things out. Tommy complied and they set out. First they left the cocktail glass at the doctor's house and then set off for a good tramp across country, discussing the case as they did so. It makes it easier somehow if one plays the fool, said Tommy. All this Hanaud business. I suppose some people would think I didn't care. But I do, most awfully. I feel that somehow or other we ought to have prevented this. I think that's foolish of you, said Tuppence. It is not as though we had advised Lois Hargreaves not to go to Scotland Yard or anything like that. Nothing would have induced her to bring the police into the matter. If she hadn't come to us, she would have done nothing at all. And the result would have been the same. Yes, you are right, Tuppence. It's morbid to reproach oneself over something one couldn't help. What I would like to do is to make good now. And that's not going to be easy, no, it isn't. There are so many possibilities, and yet all of them seem wild and improbable. Supposing Dennis Radcliffe put the poison in the sandwiches. He knew he would be out to tea. That seems fairly plain sailing. Yes, said Tuppence, that's all right so far. Then we can put against that the fact that he was poisoned himself, so that seems to rule him out. There is one person we mustn't forget, and that is Hannah. Hannah. People do all sorts of queer things when they have religious mania. She is pretty far gone with it too, said Tommy. You ought to drop a word to Dr. Burton about it. It must have come on very rapidly, said Tuppence. That is if we go by what Miss Logan said. I believe religious mania does, said Tommy. I mean, you go on singing hymns in your bedroom with the door open for years, and then you go suddenly right over the line and become violent. There is certainly more evidence against Hannah than against anybody else, said Tuppence thoughtfully, and yet I have an idea dash. She stopped. Yes, said Tommy encouragingly. It is not really an idea. I suppose it is just a prejudice. A prejudice against someone. Tuppence nodded. Tommy, did you like Mary Chilcot? Tommy considered. Yes, I think I did. She struck me as extremely capable and businesslike, perhaps a shade too much so, but very reliable. You didn't think it was odd that she didn't seem more upset? Well, in a way that is a point in her favor. I mean, if she had done anything, she would make a point of being upset, lay it on rather thick. I suppose so, said Tuppence. And anyway, there doesn't seem to be any motive in her case. One doesn't see what good this wholesale slaughter can do her. I suppose none of the servants are concerned. It doesn't seem likely. They seem a quiet, reliable lot. I wonder what Esther Quant, the parlor maid, was like. You mean, that if she was young and good-looking there was a chance that she was mixed up in it some way? That is what I mean. Tuppence sighed. It is all very discouraging. Well, I suppose the police will get down to it all right, said Tommy. Probably. I should like it to be us. By the way, did you notice a lot of small red dots on Miss Logan's arm? I don't think I did. What about them? They looked as though they were made by a hypodermic syringe, said Tuppence. Probably Dr. Burton gave her a hypodermic injection of some kind. Oh, very likely. But he wouldn't give her about 40 the cocaine habit, suggested Tommy helpfully. I thought of that, said Tuppence, but her eyes were all right. You would see at once if it was cocaine or morphia. Besides, she doesn't look that sort of old lady. Most respectable and God-fearing, agreed Tommy. It is all very difficult, said Tuppence. We have talked and we don't seem any nearer now than we were. Don't let's forget to call at the doctor's on our way home. The doctor's door was opened by a lanky boy of about 15. Mr. Blunt? He inquired. Yes, the doctor is out, but he left a note for you in case you should call. He handed them the note in question and Tommy tore it open. Dear Mr. Blunt, there is reason to believe that the poison employed was ricin, a vegetable toxalbumose of tremendous potency. Please keep this to yourself for the present. Tommy let the note drop, but picked it up quickly. Ricin, he murmured. Know anything about it, Tuppence? You used to be rather well up in these things. Ricin, said Tuppence, thoughtfully. You get it out of castor oil, I believe. I never did take kindly to castor oil, said Tommy. I am more set against it than ever now. The oil's all right. You get ricin from the seeds of the castor oil plant. I believe I saw some castor oil plants in the garden this morning, big things with glossy leaves. You mean that someone extracted the stuff on the premises? Could Hannah do such a thing? Tuppence shook her head. Doesn't seem likely. She wouldn't know enough. Suddenly Tommy gave an exclamation. That book. Have I got it in my pocket still? Yes. He took it out, and turned over the leaves vehemently. I thought so. Here's the page, it was open at this morning. Do you see, Tuppence? Ryson. Tuppence seized the book from him. Can you make head or tail of it? I can't. It's clear enough to me, said Tuppence. She walked along, reading busily, with one hand on Tommy's arm to steer herself. Presently she shut the book with a bang. They were just approaching the house again. Tommy, will you leave this to me? Just for once, you see, I am the bull that has been more than 20 minutes in the arena. Tommy nodded. You shall be the captain of the ship, Tuppence, he said gravely. We've got to get to the bottom of this. First of all, said Tuppence as they entered the house, I must ask Miss Logan one more question. She ran upstairs. Tommy followed her. She rapped sharply on the old lady's door, and went in. Is that you, my dear? Said Miss Logan. You know you are much too young and pretty to be a detective. Have you found out anything? Yes, said Tuppence. I have. Miss Logan looked at her questioningly. I don't know about being pretty, went on Tuppence, but being young. I happened to work in a hospital during the war. I know something about serum therapeutics. I happen to know that when ricin is injected in small doses, hypodermically immunity is produced, anti-ricin is formed. That fact paved the way for the foundation of serum therapeutics. You knew that, Miss Logan? You injected ricin for some time hypodermically into yourself. Then you let yourself be poisoned with the rest. You helped your father in his work, and you knew all about ricin and how to obtain it and extract it from the seeds. You chose a day when Dennis Radcliffe was out for tea. It wouldn't do for him to be poisoned at the same time. He might die before Lois Hargreaves. So long as she died first, he inherited her money, and at his death it passes to you, his next of kin. You remember, you told us this morning that his father was your first cousin. The old lady stared at Tuppence with baleful eyes. Suddenly a wild figure burst in from the adjoining room. It was Hannah. In her hand she held a lighted torch which she waved frantically. Truth has been spoken. That is the wicked one. I saw her reading the book, and smiling to herself, and I knew. I found the book and the page, but it said nothing to me. But the voice of the Lord spoke to me. She hated my mistress, her ladyship. She was always jealous and envious. She hated my own sweet Miss Lois. But the wicked shall perish, the fire of the Lord shall consume them. Waving her torch she sprang forward to the bed. A cry arose from the old lady. Take her away, take her away. It's true, but take her away. Tuppence flung herself upon Hannah, but the woman managed to set fire to the curtains of the bed before Tuppence could get the torch from her and stamp on it. Tommy, however, had rushed in from the landing outside. He tore down the bed hangings and managed to stifle the flames with a rug. Then he rushed to Tuppence's assistance, and between them they subdued Hannah just as Dr. Burton came hurrying in. A very few words sufficed to put him au courant of the situation. He hurried to the bedside, lifted Miss Logan's hand, then uttered a sharp exclamation. The shock of fire has been too much for her. She's dead. Perhaps it is as well under the circumstances. He paused and then added, there was ricin in the cocktail glass as well. It's the best thing that could have happened, said Tommy when they had relinquished Hannah to the doctor's care, and were alone together. Tuppence, you were simply marvelous. There wasn't much Hannah about it, said Tuppence. It was too serious for play acting. I still can't bear to think of that girl. I won't think of her. Gut, as I said before, you were marvelous. The honors are with you. To use a familiar quotation, it is a great advantage to be intelligent and not to look it. Tommy, said Tuppence. You're a beast. 19 The unbreakable alibi. Tommy and Tuppence were busy sorting correspondence. Tuppence gave an exclamation and handed a letter across to Tommy. A new client, she said importantly. Ha, said Tommy. What do we deduce from this letter, Watson? Nothing much, except the somewhat obvious fact that Mr. E.R. Montgomery Jones is not one of the world's best spellers, thereby proving that he has been expensively educated. Montgomery Jones, said Tuppence. Now what do I know about a Montgomery Jones? Oh, yes, I have got it now. I think Janet St. Vincent mentioned him. His mother was Lady Aileen Montgomery, very crusty in high church, with gold crosses and things, and she married a man called Jones who is immensely rich. In fact, the same old story, said Tommy. Let me see, what time does this Mr. MJ wish to see us? Ah, 11:30. At 11:30 precisely a very tall young man with an amiable and ingenuous countenance entered the outer office and addressed himself to Albert, the office boy. Look here, I say. Can I see Mr. E.R. Blunt? Have you an appointment, sir? Said Albert. I don't quite know. Yes, I suppose I have. What I mean is I wrote a letter. What name, sir? Mr. Montgomery Jones. I will take your name in to Mr. Blunt. He returned after a brief interval. Will you wait a few minutes, please, sir? Mr. Blunt is engaged on a very important conference at present. Oh, yes, certainly, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. Having, he hoped, impressed his client sufficiently, Tommy rang the buzzer on his desk, and Mr. Montgomery Jones was ushered into the inner office by Albert. Tommy rose to greet him, and shaking him warmly by the hand motioned towards the vacant chair. Now, Mr. Montgomery Jones, he said briskly, what can we have the pleasure of doing for you? Mr. Montgomery Jones looked uncertainly at the third occupant of the office. My confidential secretary, Miss Robinson, said Tommy. You can speak quite freely before her. I take it that this is some family matter of a delicate kind. Well, not exactly, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. You surprise me, said Tommy. You are not in trouble of any kind yourself, I hope. Oh, rather not, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. Well, said Tommy, perhaps you will state the facts plainly. That, however, seemed to be the one thing that Mr. Montgomery Jones could not do. It's a dashed odd sort of thing I have got to ask you, he said hesitatingly. I really don't know how to set about it. We never touch divorce cases, said Tommy. Oh Lord, no, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. I don't mean that. It is just, well, it's a deuced silly sort of a joke. That's all. Someone has played a practical joke on you of a mysterious nature, suggested Tommy. But Mr. Montgomery Jones once more shook his head. Well, said Tommy, retiring gracefully from the position, take your own time and let us have it in your own words. There was a pause. You see, said Mr. Jones at last, it was at dinner. I sat next to a girl. Yes, said Tommy encouragingly. She was well, I really can't describe her, but she was simply one of the most sporting girls I ever met. She's an Australian over here with another girl, sharing a flat with her in Clarges Street. She's simply game for anything. I absolutely can't tell you the effect that girl had on me. We can quite imagine it, Mr. Jones, said Tuppence. She saw clearly that if Mr. Montgomery Jones' troubles were ever to be extracted, a sympathetic feminine touch was needed, as distinct from the businesslike methods of Mr. Blunt. We can understand, said Tuppence encouragingly. Well, the whole thing came as an absolute shock to me, said Mr. Montgomery Jones, that a girl could, well, knock you over like that. There had been another girl, in fact 2 other girls. One was awfully jolly and all that, but I didn't much like her chin. She danced marvelously though, and I have known her all my life, which makes a fellow feel kind of safe, you know. And then there was one of the girls at the Frivolity, frightfully amusing, but of course there would be a lot of ructions with Mater over that, and anyway I really didn't want to marry either of them, but I was thinking about things, you know, and then slap out of the blue I sat next to this girl and the whole world was changed, said Tuppence in a feeling voice. Tommy moved impatiently in his chair. He was by now somewhat bored by the recital of Mr. Montgomery Jones' love affairs. You put it awfully well, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. That is absolutely what it was like. Only, you know, I fancy she didn't think much of me. You mayn't think it, but I am not terribly clever. Oh, you mustn't be too modest, said Tuppence. Oh, I do realize that I am not much of a chap, said Mr. Jones with an engaging smile. Not for a perfectly marvelous girl like that. That is why I just feel I have got to put this thing through. It's my only chance. She's such a sporting girl that she would never go back on her word. Well, I am sure we wish you luck and all that, said Tuppence kindly. But I don't exactly see what you want us to do. Oh Lordle, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. Haven't I explained? No, said Tommy. You haven't. Well, it was like this. We were talking about detective stories. Una, that's her name, is just as keen about them as I am. We got talking about one in particular. It all hinges on an alibi. Then we got talking about alibis and faking them. Then I said no. She said, now which of us was it that said it? Never mind which of you it was, said Tuppence. I said it would be a jolly difficult thing to do. She disagreed, said it only wanted a bit of brain work. We got all hot and excited about it, and in the end she said, I will make you a sporting offer. What do you bet that I can produce an alibi that nobody can shake? Anything you like, I said, and we settled it then and there. She was frightfully cocksure about the whole thing. It's an odds-on chance for me, she said. Don't be so sure of that, I said. Supposing you lose and I ask you for anything I like. She laughed and said she came of a gambling family and I could. Well, said Tuppence as Mr. Jones came to a pause and looked at her appealingly. Well, don't you see? It is up to me. It is the only chance I have got of getting a girl like that to look at me. You have no idea how sporting she is. Last summer she was out in a boat and someone bet her she wouldn't jump overboard and swim ashore in her clothes, and she did it. It is a very curious proposition, said Tommy. I am not quite sure I yet understand it. It is perfectly simple, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. You must be doing this sort of thing all the time. Investigating fake alibis and seeing where they fall down. Oh yes, of course, said Tommy. We do a lot of that sort of work. Someone has got to do it for me, said Montgomery Jones. I shouldn't be any good at that sort of thing myself. You have only got to catch her out and everything is all right. I dare say it seems rather a futile business to you, but it means a lot to me and I am prepared to pay all necessary what-nots, you know. That will be all right, said Tuppence. I am sure Mr. Blunt will take the case on for you. Certainly, certainly, said Tommy. A most refreshing case, most refreshing indeed. Mr. Montgomery Jones heaved a sigh of relief and pulled a mass of papers from his pocket and selected one of them. Here it is, he said. She says, I am sending you proof I was in two distinct places at one and the same time. According to one story, I dined at the Bontemps restaurant in Soho by myself, went to the Duke's Theatre and had supper with a friend, Mr. L.E. Marchant, at the Savoy, but I was also staying at the Castle Hotel, Torquay, and only returned to London on the following morning. You have got to find out which of the two stories is the true one and how I managed the other. There, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. Now you see what it is that I want you to do. A most refreshing little problem, said Tommy. Very endive. Here is Una's photograph, said Mr. Montgomery Jones. You will want that. What is the lady's full name? Inquired Tommy. Miss Una Drake. And her address is 180, Clarges Street. Thank you, said Tommy. Well, we will look into the matter for you, Mr. Montgomery Jones. I hope we shall have good news for you very shortly. I say, you know, I am no end grateful, said Mr. Jones, rising to his feet and shaking Tommy by the hand. It has taken an awful load off my mind. Having seen his client out, Tommy returned to the inner office. Tuppence was at the cupboard that contained the classic library. Inspector French, said Tuppence. Said Tommy. Inspector French, of course, said Tuppence. He always does alibis. I know the exact procedure. We have to go over everything and check it. At first it will seem all right, and then when we examine it more closely we shall find the flaw. There ought not to be much difficulty about that, agreed Tommy. I mean, knowing that one of them is a fake to start with makes the thing almost a certainty, I should say. That is what worries me. I don't see anything to worry about in that. I am worrying about the girl, said Tommy. She will probably be let in to marry that young man whether she wants to or not. Darling, said Tuppence, don't be foolish. Women are never the wild gamblers they appear. Unless that girl was already perfectly prepared to marry that pleasant but rather empty-headed young man, she would never have let herself in for a wager of this kind. But, Tommy, believe me, she will marry him with more enthusiasm and respect if he wins the wager than if she has to make it easy for him some other way. You do think you know about everything, said her husband. I do, said Tuppence. And now to examine our data, said Tommy, drawing the papers towards him. First the photograph, quite a nice looking girl and quite a good photograph I should say. Clear and easily recognizable. We must get some other girls' photographs, said Tuppence. Why? They always do, said Tuppence. You show 4 or 5 to waiters and they pick out the right one. Do you think they do, said Tommy. Pick out the right one I mean. Well, they do in books, said Tuppence. It is a pity that real life is so different from fiction, said Tommy. Now then, what have we here? Yes, this is the London lot. Dined at the Bontemps 7:30. Went to Duke's Theatre and saw Delphinium's Blue. Counterfoil of theatre ticket enclosed. Supper at the Savoy with Mr. L. E. Marchant. We can, I suppose, interview Mr. L. E. Marchant. That tells us nothing at all, said Tuppence, because if he is helping her to do it he naturally won't give the show away. We can wash out anything he says now. Well, here is the Torquay end, went on Tommy. 12 o'clock train from Paddington, had lunch in the restaurant car, receipt bill enclosed. Stayed at Castle Hotel for 1 night. Again receipt bill. I think this is all rather weak, said Tuppence. Anyone can buy a theatre ticket, you need never go near the theatre. The girl just went to Torquay and the London thing is a fake. If so, it is rather a sitter for us, said Tommy. Well, I suppose we might as well go and interview Mr. I. E. Marchant. Mr. L. E. Marchant proved to be a breezy youth who betrayed no great surprise on seeing them. Una has got some little game on, hasn't she? He asked. You never know what that kid is up to. I understand, Mr. L. E. Marchant, said Tommy, that Miss Drake had supper with you at the Savoy last Tuesday evening. That's right, said Mr. L. E. Marchant. I know it was Tuesday because Una impressed it on me at the time, and what's more she made me write it down in a little book. With some pride he showed an entry faintly penciled, having supper with Una. Savoy. Tuesday 19th. Where had Miss Drake been earlier in the evening? Do you know? She had been to some rotten show called Pink Peonies or something like that. Absolute slosh, so she told me. You are quite sure Miss Drake was with you that evening? Mr. L. E. Marchant stared at him. Why, of course. Haven't I been telling you? Perhaps she asked you to tell us, said Tuppence. Well, for a matter of fact she did say something that was rather dashed odd. She said, what was it now? You think you are sitting here having supper with me, Jimmy, but really, I am having supper 200 miles away in Devonshire. Now that was a dashed odd thing to say, don't you think so? Sort of astral body stuff. The funny thing is that a pal of mine, Dickie Rice, thought he saw her there. Who is this Mr. Rice? Oh, just a friend of mine. He had been down in Torquay staying with an aunt. Sort of old bean who is always going to die and never does. Dickie had been down doing the dutiful nephew. He said, I saw that Australian girl one day, Una something or other. Wanted to go and talk to her, but my aunt carried me off to chat with an old pussy in a bath chair. I said, when was this? And he said, oh, Tuesday about tea time. I told him of course that he had made a mistake, but it was odd, wasn't it? With Una saying that about Devonshire that evening. Very odd, said Tommy. Tell me, Mr. L. E. Marchant, did anyone you know have supper near you at the Savoy? Some people called Oglander were at the next table. Do they know Miss Drake? Oh yes, they know her. They are not frightful friends or anything of that kind. Well, if there's nothing more you can tell us, Mr. L. E. Marchant, I think we will wish you good morning. Either that chap is an extraordinary good liar, said Tommy as they reached the street, or else he is speaking the truth. Yes, said Tuppence. I have changed my opinion. I have a sort of feeling now that Una Drake was at the Savoy for supper that night. We will now go to the Bon Temps, said Tommy. A little food for starving sleuths is clearly indicated. Let's just get a few girls' photographs first. This proved rather more difficult than was expected. Turning into a photographer's and demanding a few assorted photographs, they were met with a cold rebuff. Why are all the things that are so easy and simple in books so difficult in real life? Wailed Tuppence. How horribly suspicious they looked. What do you think they thought we wanted to do with the photographs? We had better go and raid Jane's flat. Tuppence's friend Jane proved of an accommodating disposition and permitted Tuppence to rummage in a drawer and select 4 specimens of former friends of Jane's who had been shoved hastily in to be out of sight and mind. Armed with this galaxy of feminine beauty, they proceeded to the Bon Temps, where fresh difficulties and much expense awaited them. Tommy had to get hold of each waiter in turn, tip him and then produce the assorted photographs. The result was unsatisfactory. At least 3 of the photographs were promising starters as having dined there last Tuesday. They then returned to the office, where Tuppence immersed herself in an AGC Paddington 12 o'clock. Torquay 3:35. That's the train, and L.E. Marchant's friend, Mr. Sago, or Tapioca or something, saw her there about tea time. We haven't checked his statement, remember, said Tommy. If, as you said to begin with, L.E. Marchant is a friend of Una Drake's, he may have invented this story. Oh, we'll hunt up Mr. Rice, said Tuppence. I have a kind of hunch that Mr. L.E. Marchant was speaking the truth. No, what I am trying to get at now is this. Una Drake leaves London by the 12 o'clock train, possibly takes a room at a hotel and unpacks. Then she takes a train back to town, arriving in time to get to the Savoy. There is one at 4:40, gets up to Paddington at 9:10. And then, said Tommy. And then, said Tuppence, frowning, it is rather more difficult. There is a midnight train from Paddington down again, but she could hardly take that, that would be too early. A fast car, suggested Tommy. Said Tuppence. It is just on 200 miles. Australians, I have always been told, drive very recklessly. Oh, I suppose it could be done, said Tuppence. She would arrive there about 7. Are you supposing her to have nipped into her bed at the Castle Hotel without being seen? Or arriving there explaining that she had been out all night, and could she have her bill, please? Tommy, said Tuppence. We are idiots. She needn't have gone back to Torquay at all. She has only got to get a friend to go to the hotel there and collect her luggage and pay her bill. Then you get the receipt bill with the proper date on it. I think on the whole we have worked out a very sound hypothesis, said Tommy. The next thing to do is to catch the 12 o'clock train to Torquay tomorrow and verify our brilliant conclusions. Armed with a portfolio of photographs, Tommy and Tuppence duly established themselves in a first-class carriage the following morning, and booked seats for the second lunch. It probably won't be the same dining car attendants, said Tommy. That would be too much luck to expect. I expect we shall have to travel up and down to Torquay for days before we strike the right ones. This alibi business is very trying, said Tuppence. In books it is all passed over in 2 or 3 paragraphs. Inspector Something then boarded the train to Torquay and questioned the dining car attendants, and so ended the story. For once, however, the young couple's luck was in. In answer to their question, the attendant who brought their bill for lunch proved to be the same one who had been on duty the preceding Tuesday. What Tommy called the 10-shilling note touch then came into action, and Tuppence produced the portfolio. I want to know, said Tommy, if any of these ladies had lunch on this train on Tuesday last. In a gratifying manner worthy of the best detective fiction, the man at once indicated the photograph of Una Drake. Yes, sir, I remember that lady, and I remember that it was Tuesday, because the lady herself drew attention to the fact, saying it was always the luckiest day in the week for her. So far, so good, said Tuppence as they returned to their compartment. And we will probably find that she booked at the hotel all right. It is going to be more difficult to prove that she traveled back to London, but perhaps one of the porters at the station may remember. Here, however, they drew a blank, and crossing to the up platform, Tommy made inquiries of the ticket collector and of various porters. After the distribution of half-crowns as a preliminary to inquiring, two of the porters picked out one of the other photographs with a vague remembrance that someone like that traveled to town by the 4:40 that afternoon, but there was no identification of Una Drake. "But that doesn't prove anything," said Tuppence as they left the station. "She may have traveled by that train and no one noticed her. She may have gone from the other station, from Torre." "That's quite likely," said Tuppence. "However, we can see to that after we have been to the hotel." The Castle Hotel was a big one overlooking the sea. After booking a room for the night and signing the register, Tommy observed pleasantly, "I believe you had a friend of ours staying here last Tuesday. Miss Una Drake." The young lady in the bureau beamed at him. "Oh yes, I remember quite well. An Australian young lady, I believe." At a sign from Tommy, Tuppence produced the photograph. "That is rather a charming photograph of her, isn't it?" said Tuppence. "Oh, very nice indeed, quite stylish." "Did she stay here long?" inquired Tommy. "Only one night. She went away by the express the next morning back to London. It seemed a long way to come for one night, but of course I suppose Australian ladies don't think anything of traveling." "She is a very sporting girl," said Tommy, "always having adventures. It wasn't here, was it, that she went out to dine with some friends, went for a drive in their car afterwards, ran the car into a ditch and wasn't able to get home till morning?" "Oh, no," said the young lady. "Miss Drake had dinner here in the hotel." "Really?" said Tommy, "are you sure of that? I mean, how do you know?" "Oh, I saw her. I asked because I understood she was dining with some friends in Torquay," explained Tommy. "Oh, no sir, she dined here." The young lady laughed and blushed a little. "I remember she had on a most sweetly pretty frock. One of those new flowered chiffons all over pansies." "Tuppence, this tears it," said Tommy when they had been shown upstairs to their room. "It does rather," said Tuppence. "Of course that woman may be mistaken. We will ask the waiter at dinner. There can't be very many people here just at this time of year." This time it was Tuppence who opened the attack. "Can you tell me if a friend of mine was here last Tuesday?" she asked the waiter with an engaging smile. "A Miss Drake, wearing a frock all over pansies, I believe." She produced a photograph. "This lady?" The waiter broke into immediate smiles of recognition. Yes, Miss Drake. I remember her very well. She told me she came from Australia. She dined here." "Yes. It was last Tuesday. She asked me if there was anything to do afterwards in the town." "Yes. I told her the theater, the pavilion, but in the end she decided not to go and she stayed here listening to our orchestra." "Oh damn," said Tommy under his breath. "You don't remember what time she had dinner, do you?" said Tuppence. "She came down a little late. It must have been about 8 o'clock." "Damn, blast, and curse," said Tuppence as she and Tommy left the dining room. "Tommy, this is all going wrong. It seemed so clear and lovely. Well, I suppose we ought to have known it wouldn't all be plain sailing. Is there any train she could have taken after that, I wonder? Not one that would have landed her in London in time to go to the Savoy." "Well," said Tuppence, "as a last hope I am going to talk to the chambermaid. Una Drake had a room on the same floor as ours." The chambermaid was a voluble and informative woman. Yes, she remembered the young lady quite well. That was her picture right enough. A very nice young lady, very merry and talkative. Had told her a lot about Australia and the kangaroos. The young lady rang the bell about 9:30 and asked for her bottle to be filled and put in her bed, and also to be called the next morning at 7:30 with coffee instead of tea. "You did call her and she was in bed?" asked Tuppence. The chambermaid stared at her. "Why, yes ma'am, of course." "Oh, I only wondered if she was doing exercises or anything," said Tuppence, wildly. "So many people do in the early morning." "Well, that seems cast iron enough," said Tommy, when the chambermaid had departed. "There is only one conclusion to be drawn from it. It is the London side of the thing that must be faked. Mr. L.E. Marchant must be a more accomplished liar than we thought," said Tuppence. "We have a way of checking his statements," said Tommy. "He said there were people sitting at the next table whom Una knew slightly. What was their name? Oglander, that was it. We must hunt up these Oglanders, and we ought also to make inquiries at Miss Drake's flat in Clarges Street." The following morning they paid their bill and departed somewhat crestfallen. Hunting out the Oglanders was fairly easy with the aid of the telephone book. Tuppence this time took the offensive and assumed the character of a representative of a new illustrated paper. She called on Mrs. Oglander asking for a few details of their smart supper party at the Savoy on Tuesday evening. These details Mrs. Oglander was only too willing to supply. Just as she was leaving, Tuppence added carelessly, "Let me see, wasn't Miss Una Drake sitting at the table next you? Is it really true that she is engaged to the Duke of Perth? You know her, of course." "I know her slightly," said Mrs. Oglander. "A very charming girl, I believe." "Yes, she was sitting at the next table to ours with Mr. L.E. Marchant. My girls know her better than I do." Tuppence's next port of call was the flat in Clarges Street. Here she was greeted by Miss Maria E. Lester, the friend with whom Miss Drake shared a flat. "Do tell me what all this is about," asked Miss Lester plaintively. "Una has some deep game on and I don't know what it is. Of course she slept here on Tuesday night. Did you see her when she came in?" "No, I had gone to bed." "She has got her own latchkey, of course. She came in about 1 o'clock, I believe." "When did you see her?" "Oh, the next morning about 9, or perhaps it was nearer 10. As Tuppence left the flat she almost collided with a tall, gaunt female who was entering. "Excuse me, miss, I'm sure," said the gaunt female. "Do you work here?" asked Tuppence. "Yes, miss, I come daily." "What time do you get here in the morning?" 9 o'clock is my time, miss." Tuppence slipped a hurried half-crown into the gaunt female's hand. "Was Miss Drake here last Tuesday morning when you arrived?" "Why yes, miss, indeed she was. Fast asleep in her bed and hardly woke up when I brought her in her tea." "Oh, thank you," said Tuppence and went disconsolately down the stairs. She had arranged to meet Tommy for lunch in a small restaurant in Soho, and there they compared notes. "I have seen that fellow, Rice. It is quite true he did see Una Drake in the distance at Torquay." "Well," said Tuppence, "we have checked these alibis all right. Here, give me a bit of paper and a pencil, Tommy. Let us put it down neatly like all detectives do. 1.30 Una Drake seen in luncheon car of train. 40 clock arrives at Castle Hotel. 50 clock seen by Mr. Rice. 80 clock seen dining at hotel. 9.30 asks for hot water bottle. 11:30 seen at Savoy with Mr. L.E. Marchant. 7:30 am called by chambermaid at Castle Hotel. 90 clock called by charwoman at flat at Clarges Street." They looked at each other. "Well, it looks to me as if Blunt's brilliant detectives are beat," said Tommy. "Oh, we mustn't give up," said Tuppence. "Somebody must be lying. The queer thing is that it strikes me nobody was lying. They all seemed perfectly truthful and straightforward. Yet there must be a flaw. We know there is. I think of all sorts of things like private aeroplanes, but that doesn't really get us any forwarder. I am inclined to the theory of an astral body." "Well," said Tuppence, "the only thing to do is to sleep on it. Your subconscious works in your sleep." Said Tommy. "If your subconscious provides you with a perfectly good answer to this riddle by tomorrow morning, I take off my hat to it." They were very silent all that evening. Again and again Tuppence reverted to the paper of Times. She wrote things on bits of paper. She murmured to herself, she sought perplexedly through rail guides. But in the end they both rose to go to bed with no faint glimmer of light on the problem. "This is very disheartening," said Tommy. "One of the most miserable evenings I have ever spent," said Tuppence. "We ought to have gone to a music hall," said Tommy. A few good jokes about mothers-in-law and twins and bottles of beer would have done us no end of good. No, you will see this concentration will work in the end, said Tuppence. How busy our subconscious will have to be in the next 8 hours. And on this hopeful note they went to bed. Well, said Tommy next morning, has the subconscious worked? I have got an idea, said Tuppence. You have? What sort of an idea? Well, rather a funny idea. Not at all like anything I have ever read in detective stories. As a matter of fact, it is an idea that you put into my head. Then it must be a good idea, said Tommy firmly. Come on, Tuppence, out with it. I shall have to send a cable to verify it, said Tuppence. No, I am not going to tell you. It's a perfectly wild idea, but it's the only thing that fits the facts. Well, said Tommy, I must away to the office. A roomful of disappointed clients must not wait in vain. I leave this case in the hands of my promising subordinate. Tuppence nodded cheerfully. She did not put in an appearance at the office all day. When Tommy returned that evening about 5:30, it was to find a wildly exultant Tuppence awaiting him. I have done it, Tommy. I have solved the mystery of the alibi. We can charge up all these half-crowns and 10-shilling notes and demand a substantial fee of our own from Mr. Montgomery Jones, and he can go right off and collect his girl. What is the solution? Cried Tommy. A perfectly simple one, said Tuppence. Twins. What do you mean, twins? Why, just that. Of course it is the only solution. I will say you put it into my head last night talking about mothers-in-law, twins, and bottles of beer. I cabled to Australia and got back the information I wanted. Una has a twin sister, Vera, who arrived in England last Monday. That is why she was able to make this bet so spontaneously. She thought it would be a frightful rag on poor Montgomery Jones. The sister went to Torquay and she stayed in London. Do you think she'll be terribly despondent that she's lost? Asked Tommy. No, said Tuppence. I don't. I gave you my views about that before. She will put all the kudos down to Montgomery Jones. I always think respect for your husband's abilities should be the foundation of married life. I am glad to have inspired these sentiments in you, Tuppence. It is not a really satisfactory solution, said Tuppence. Not the ingenious sort of flaw that Inspector French would have detected. Nonsense, said Tommy. I think the way I showed these photographs to the waiter in the restaurant was exactly like Inspector French.